The condensation on my crystal tumbler was the only thing sweating in the room. I sat in my corner office on the 48th floor of the Sterling and Associates building, the skeletal remains of Wall Street glowing amber beneath me. It was 2:47 a.m. In the silence of the skyscraper, the city didn't sleep. It just waited for someone to blink. I didn't blink. I was staring at a PDF on my dual monitors, a forensic audit of my father's legacy real estate portfolio. It was a masterpiece of fiction, a labyrinth of shell companies and forged signatures that would make Madoff blush. Then the silence was shattered. My personal iPhone, the one only my family and my emergency contacts, had begun to vibrate against the mahogany desk. The caller ID read Newport Police Department. I took a slow sip of the 18-year-old Macallan, letting the peat burn my throat before sliding the green icon to answer. Maya Sterling. I said, my voice as crisp as a fresh $100 bill. Ms. Sterling. This is Officer Miller with the Newport PD. The voice sounded weary, punctuated by the crackle of a radio in the background. I'm currently standing at the gates of 42 Ocean Drive. I have a Mr. Arthur Sterling and a Mrs. Lillian Sterling on the line with my dispatcher. They are filing an emergency report against you. I swiveled my chair toward the window. Mr. Watching a lone tugboat crawl across the Hudson. An emergency report. Did someone break a porcelain doll? No, ma'am. Miller cleared his throat, sounding embarrassed. They're reporting an illegal lockout and malicious endangerment. They claim you've remotely disabled the security system, cut the power, and terminated the water supply to the property while they are in residence. They're claiming squatters' rights and an established tenancy. I let out a soft, melodic laugh that didn't reach my eyes. Officer, let's be precise. I didn't cut the power. I simply stopped paying for it. That property is titled in my name under my private LLC. My parents are guests who have overstayed their welcome by approximately 5 years. Ms. Sterling, they're elderly. The officer's tone took on a judgmental edge, the classic honors thy father and mother tone that my parents had weaponized since I was in pigtails. They're sitting in the dark in a coastal storm. They're demanding you restore the utilities immediately, or they'll press charges for harassment. I looked down at the second document on my desk, fresh off the encrypted fax line. It was a federal warrant signed by a judge 2 hours ago. Officer Miller, I said, my voice dropping an octave into the tone I used when I was about to dismantle a witness in court. I appreciate your concern for the elderly, truly, but before you lecture me on my daughterly duties, you might want to check the federal database for an active NCIC alert issued by the Department of the Treasury, because as of 1 a.m., the 2 people you're talking to are the primary subjects of a multi-state bank fraud investigation. The line went dead silent. I'm not turning the lights back on. I continued, my eyes fixed on the warrant. In fact, I suggest you stay right there at the gate. My contact at the FBI tells me their field team is about 20 minutes away from your location. If you want to be a hero, make sure my father doesn't try to flush any ledgers down the dry toilets. I see, Miller stammered, the judgment in his voice evaporating. Tell them I said good night, officer, and tell them not to worry about the dark. The federal holding cells in Danbury have excellent fluorescent lighting. They're very energy efficient. I hung up. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass. The reflection showed a woman who looked like the Sterling name, used to polished, unbreakable, and terrifyingly expensive. But the woman in the glass was a lie, or at least she had been funded by one. For 6 years, I had been the invisible pillar holding up a rotting temple. My father, the lion of Connecticut real estate, had lost his mane in a series of disastrous subprime bets a decade ago. But instead of retiring with dignity, he and my mother decided to play a high-stakes game of Weekend at Bernie's with their finances. They used my credit. They used my law degree to legitimize their contracts. They used my soul as a line of credit. I had been their silent auditor, quietly rerouting my bonuses to cover their mortgage gaps, paying the property taxes they forgot, and settling the lawsuits they didn't deserve. I did it out of a misplaced sense of loyalty until 3 months ago. Everything changed at the engagement party from hell. I closed my eyes and could still smell the salt air of the Hudson and the sickeningly sweet scent of the $500 a bottle champagne Julian was spraying like water. Julian, my younger brother, the travel influencer, whose only actual talent was spending my money while calling me uptight. That night, on a chartered yacht that cost more than a year of my law school tuition, the masks finally slipped. My parents didn't just want my help anymore. They wanted my identity. They had decided that Julian deserved a legacy, and they were going to use my blood, sweat, and billable hours to buy it for him. They thought they had trapped me. They thought that because I was a sterling, I would protect the brand at any cost. They forgot one thing: I wasn't just a sterling. I was a litigator. And in my world, when a partnership becomes a liability, you don't just leave, you liquidate. I finished the scotch, the ice clinking against the glass, the only funeral bell my family was going to get. The audit was complete, the trap was set. And as the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, I realized for the first time in 32 years, I didn't owe anyone a damn cent. I sat back down, opened a fresh folder on my desktop, and began to type. Subject: the liquidation of Arthur and Lillian Sterling. The first 10 items on my list were already checked off. The last one, that was going to be the most fun. It was time to tell the story of how the perfect Sterling family became a cautionary tale for the SEC. It started with a yacht, a fake startup, and a sister who finally decided that being the smart one meant being the most dangerous one in the room. Part 2. The $1 million mirage. The salt air off the Hudson River usually smells like ambition. But that night, it smelled like desperation, masked by Creed Aventus. 3 months ago, the Lady Alexandria, a 150-foot super yacht, was docked at Chelsea Piers, glowing like a neon monument to excess. This was Julian's strategic brand launch, which was really just a fancy way of saying he was getting engaged to a woman who had more Botox than personality, and he wanted someone else to foot the bill. I walked up the gangplank in a charcoal Armani suit, feeling like a predator in a sea of peacocks. Everywhere I looked, I saw my money. The floral arrangements were towers of white orchids that cost as much as a mid-sized sedan. The caviar station was manned by a chef flown in from Paris. Julian was at the center of a circle of investors, mostly trust fund kids he'd met at Coachella, spinning a yarn about his new venture, Vagabond Venture Capital. It's about democratizing the luxury travel space through fractionalized NFT ownership, Julian was saying, his teeth gleaming under the deck lights. He caught my eye and winked. And of course, my sister Maya over there handles the boring legal stuff. She's the hammer that makes sure the nails stay down. I didn't wink back. I was too busy calculating the overhead of the open bar. I found my mother Lillian near the stern. She looked radiant in champagne silk, her neck draped in the Sterling family emeralds. Emeralds that I knew for a fact had been appraised for insurance purposes as high-quality glass 3 years ago, when the originals were lost, sold to pay off a gambling debt Arthur incurred in Macau. "Maya, darling," she trilled, her voice hitting that pitch of forced cheer that always signaled a crisis. "You look so professional. Doesn't Julian look like a king tonight?" "Kings usually have kingdoms, mother," I replied. "Julian has a TikTok following and a lease on a studio apartment he hasn't paid in 4 months." Before she could launch into her usual lecture about supporting the vision, my father Arthur appeared. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had spent the last hour in the head, splashing cold water on his face. He gripped my elbow and leaned in his breath, smelling of expensive gin and cheap fear. Study, we need a word. In the VIP lounge, now. The VIP lounge was a soundproofed cocoon of quilted leather and dim lighting. When the door clicked shut, the muffled thump of the DJ's bass was the only sound. The caterer, Arthur started pacing the small space, and the yacht captain. They're being difficult. Define difficult, Arthur, I said, leaning against the doorframe. They won't accept the wire transfer confirmation, he hissed. They're saying the routing number is invalid. It's a glitch, obviously, a banking error. But they're threatening to cut the music and head back to the pier in the middle of the toast. Chloe's parents are out there, Maya. They're old-school Greenwich money. If they think we're struggling, we aren't struggling, Arthur, I corrected him. You are broke. There's a difference. Don't be cruel, Lillian whispered, fluttering her fan. Julian's future depends on this. Chloe's father is looking to invest $5 million in Julian's fund. We just need to get through the night. It's 50,000 Maya. A drop in the bucket for a senior partner at a firm like yours. I am a litigator, not a charity, I said. And that drop in the bucket represents 600 billable hours of me tearing people apart so you can pretend to be the Vanderbilts. Maya Catherine Sterling. Arthur's voice boomed, trying to reclaim the patriarchal authority he'd squandered years ago. I gave you the name that got you into that law school. I gave you the connections that got you that first internship. You owe us this. You owe Julian this. It was the same old song, the Sterling legacy tax. They had spent 30 years convinced that my success was merely an interest payment on the life they had provided for me. I looked at the clock. 9:15 p.m. In 15 minutes, Julian was supposed to propose with a 3-carat diamond that I suspected was also on a memo from a jeweler friend of Arthur's. If the boat docked now, the illusion would shatter. The investors would vanish. Chloe's Greenwich money father would take his daughter and his $5 million and run. And more importantly, the Sterling name, the only thing I had left of my own identity in this city, would be dragged through the mud of every gossip column in Manhattan. Fine, I said the word, feeling like ash in my mouth. I'll pay, but I want the ledgers for the Newport house delivered to my office by Monday, every single one. Of course, darling, anything, Lillian beamed, reaching out to pat my cheek. I flinched away. I walked to the purser's office and handed over my black corporate card. $52,000, including the disruption fee. As I signed the receipt, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't a gift. It was a purchase. I had just bought the right to be done with them. I returned to the deck, just as the music swelled. Julian was on one knee. The crowd was hushed. Phones held aloft like glowing offerings. Chloe. Julian's voice was amplified by the ship's speakers, dripping with a sincerity he'd practiced in front of a mirror. My family has always believed that true wealth isn't just about what you have, but what you leave behind. A legacy of love, of stability, and of home. He gestured to my father, who stepped forward with a smug, triumphant grin. Which is why, Arthur announced, his voice carrying over the water. It is my greatest honor to announce that as a wedding gift, Lillian and I are deeding the Sterling estate in Newport to Julian and Chloe. A $5 million legacy, free and clear for the next generation of Sterlings. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Chloe shrieked and threw her arms around Julian. My mother wept into a lace handkerchief. I stood in the shadows by the bar, my drink frozen halfway to my lips. Free and clear. The Newport estate wasn't free and clear. It was drowning. It was the very property I had been secretly subsidizing for half a decade. I had paid the property taxes in 2024. I had covered the roof repair in 2025. I was the one who had negotiated the forbearance with the bank, when Arthur tried to use it as collateral for a failed strip mall development in Jersey. They hadn't just given away a house, they had given away my house. And they had done it while using my credit card to pay for the party to announce the theft. As the fireworks began to explode over the Statue of Liberty, painting the sky in violent shades of red and gold, I didn't join the toast. I didn't cheer. I watched Arthur catch my eye from across the deck. He raised his glass to me, a predatory glint in his eyes. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd successfully transitioned the liability of the Newport house onto Julian while keeping the utility of Maya's bank account to pay for it. He thought I was a pillar. He forgot that if you pull the pillar out, the whole damn roof comes down. I finished my drink, set the glass on a passing tray, and walked toward the exit. The audit wouldn't wait until Monday. It was starting tonight. And by the time I was finished, free and clear, was going to be the exact state of my relationship with the name Sterling. The silence of my car on the ride back to Manhattan was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt of the FDR drive. My phone was an incessant glow in the cup holder texts from the Sterling family group chat photos of Chloe's ring videos of the fireworks, Julian's drunken face shouting, "Newport baby," into the camera. I didn't open them. I was calculating. In the world of corporate litigation, there is a concept called fraudulent conveyance. It's what happens when someone moves assets around to avoid creditors. My father was a master of it, but he had made a fatal error. He assumed I was a co-conspirator rather than a creditor. I pulled into my building's garage and went straight to my home office. I didn't turn on the lights. The blue glow of the city skyline was enough. I opened my personal vault and pulled out a stack of folders I'd been keeping for years, my in case of fire files. Every cent I had sent to Newport was documented. Every emergency wire transfer to Lillian, every payment to the property tax assessor. I had the receipts, and more importantly, I had the intent. For 6 years, I had behaved like a dutiful daughter. In the eyes of a judge, however, I had behaved like a lender. I had provided the capital to maintain an asset that Arthur and Lillian were now trying to gift to my brother. The audacity was breathtaking. They weren't just giving Julian a house, they were giving him my equity. They were expecting me to continue the $10,000 monthly mortgage payments under Arthur's name, so that Julian could live a lifestyle he hadn't earned, while I shouldered the debt for a property I no longer had even a theoretical claim to inherit. It was the ultimate generational grift. They had outsourced the cost of their legacy to their most competent child, effectively taxing my intelligence to subsidize Julian's incompetence. I looked at a photo on my desk from 10 years ago. Graduation day at Columbia Law. I was beaming my father's arm around my shoulder, my mother adjusting my tassel. I used to think that look in Arthur's eyes was pride. Now, through the lens of a decade of forensic accounting, I realized it was the look of a man who had just found a new high-yield revenue stream. By 4 a.m., I had mapped out the Newport property's financial skeleton. It was uglier than I thought. There was a secret secondary lien Arthur had taken out 3 years ago, likely to pay for Julian's failed luxury candle startup. I leaned back, my eyes burning. The betrayal wasn't just the money. It was the fact that they thought I was stupid. They thought my loyalty to the Sterling name was a blindfold. "Okay, Arthur," I whispered to the empty room. "You want to play free and clear? Let's see how clear things get when the fountain runs dry." The following Monday, I didn't go to the family brunch at Balthazar. I went to my office. At 9 a.m. sharp, my paralegal Sarah walked in with a stack of documents. She looked nervous. She'd been with me for 3 years and knew that when I wore my charcoal grey power suit with the sharp lapels, someone was about to have a very bad day. "Did you get the filings from the Newport County clerk?" I asked. "Yes," Sarah said, placing a manila envelope on my desk. "Your father was telling the truth at the party. The quitclaim deed was filed last Tuesday. Ownership has been transferred from Arthur and Lillian Sterling to Julian Sterling and Chloe Vance. But Maya, I know, I said, opening the envelope. He didn't transfer the mortgage. He couldn't, Sarah noted. The bank would have triggered a due-on-sale clause. So legally, Julian owns the house, but your father is still the one on the hook for the $4 million balance. And Arthur has exactly $400 in his checking account, I added, glancing at the latest bank scrapings I'd acquired, which means he's relying entirely on the automatic monthly transfer from my account to his to keep the bank from foreclosing on Julian's new gift. It was a classic squeeze. They had put me in a position where if I stopped paying, I wasn't just hurting Arthur, I was ruining Julian's life and destroying his marriage before it started. They were banking on my guilt. But they had forgotten who I was. I didn't feel guilt. I felt litigious. Sarah, I need you to draft 3 letters, I said, my voice steady. First, a formal notice to Arthur and Lillian Sterling. I am terminating all financial subsidies effective immediately. All automatic transfers have been cancelled. I am also revoking their access to the Sterling and Associates private health insurance plan, as they no longer qualify as dependents under the new firm audit. Sarah's eyes widened. That's going to hit them hard. Your father's heart medication alone is, He should have thought about his heart before he broke his daughter's trust. I cut her off. Second, a letter to the Newport County tax assessor. Inform them that as of today, I am no longer the designated payer for the Newport estate, and all future tax bills should be sent directly to the owner of record Julian Sterling. And the third, I smiled, a slow, predatory thing. The third is for the bank. I want to buy the debt, Sarah. I know the vice president of the mortgage department at Chase. I'm going to offer to buy the secondary lien on the Newport property. I want to be Julian's landlord without him ever knowing it's me. By noon, the letters were out via courier. I sat in my office and waited for the explosion. It took exactly 2 hours. My phone didn't just ring, it screamed. Arthur, Lillian, Julian, even Chloe. I ignored them all. I watched the missed calls pile up like bodies on a battlefield. Then came the emails. From Arthur Sterling, subject: What have you done? Maya, the bank just called. The mortgage payment bounced. They're threatening a default notice. How could you be so cruel? This is Julian's home. Call me immediately. From Lillian Sterling, subject: disappointed. Maya, I am shaking. My pharmacy card was declined. I had to leave my prescriptions at the counter. Is this how we raised you, to let your mother suffer because of a little misunderstanding over a house I deleted them? I wasn't letting them suffer. I was merely letting them experience the reality of their own choices. They wanted a life free and clear of Maya's control, fine. They could have it. But they had to pay for the privilege. The final straw came at 4:30 p.m. when Julian actually showed up at my office. My receptionist tried to stop him, but he pushed past, looking disheveled, his influencer cool completely evaporated. Maya, what the hell is going on? He shouted, slamming his hands on my desk. Chloe's dad was going to give me the $5 million today, but he heard a rumor that the Newport house has a lien on it. He's stalling the investment. You're ruining my deal. I didn't look up from my monitor. I'm not ruining your deal, Julian. Your father did that when he gave you a house he didn't own. And you did that when you accepted a gift you knew you couldn't afford to maintain. It's just a few months of payments, Maya. You have millions. I have millions because I work 60 hours a week and I don't give away my assets to people who don't respect me, I said, finally looking him in the eye. The look of entitlement in his gaze was chilling. He truly believed he was the victim. He truly believed that my money was, by extension, his money. Get out, Julian, I said softly. And tell Dad that if he calls my office one more time, I'll file a restraining order. I'm no longer the Sterling family's CFO. I'm just your sister. And as of right now, I'm a very, very busy woman. As he stormed out, screaming about how I was dead to the family, I felt a strange sense of peace. The Sterling legacy was a burning building, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one running inside with a fire extinguisher. I was the one who had just bought the land underneath it. I picked up the phone and dialed my contact at the bank. "It's Maya Sterling. Let's talk about that secondary lien. I'm ready to sign." The grift was over. The audit was just beginning. And Julian was about to find out that free and clear usually comes with a very, very high price tag. By Tuesday morning, the frantic energy of the weekend had transitioned into a cold, clinical reality. I was back in my office watching the rain smear the Manhattan skyline into a grey blur. On my desk sat a sleek black fountain pen and a single-page document, the assignment of the secondary lien for 42 Ocean Drive. I signed it. The ink was barely dry before I felt the shift in the atmosphere. I wasn't just a disgruntled daughter anymore. I was a secured creditor. In the original script of my life written by Arthur and Lillian, I was the good daughter, the one who absorbed the shocks, cushioned the falls, and kept the Sterling name polished. But that script was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my character. They mistook my silence for compliance. They mistook my loyalty for a lack of options. The phone on my desk buzzed. It was my assistant, Sarah. "Maya, your mother is in the lobby. She doesn't have an appointment, and she's making a scene. She's telling the security guards that you're withholding her heart medication." I leaned back, a cold smile touching my lips. My mother, the master of the public spectacle. She knew that in a firm like mine, reputation was everything. She thought she could embarrass me into submission. "Send her up, Sarah, and have a courier stand by." 5 minutes later, Lillian burst into my office. She looked every bit the tragic aristocrat. Her Chanel suit slightly rumpled, her eyes artfully rimmed with red. She didn't sit. She marched to my desk and slammed her Hermes Birkin down. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fury. "How dare you humiliate us like this? Your father spent the night in a cold sweat because he couldn't afford the premium on his life insurance. I had to walk away from the pharmacy counter like a beggar because you cancelled the cards. Is this the Sterling way, Maya? To kill your parents for the sake of a few dollars?" "It's not about the dollars with her," I said, my voice calm and low. "It's about the accounting. You and Arthur decided to liquidate my contributions to the family without my consent. You gave Julian a house that I've been paying for. You lied to his in-laws. You lied to me. I'm simply balancing the books." "We gave him a future," Lillian cried, throwing her hands up. "Julian is sensitive. He's a dreamer. He needs a base to build his brand. You're a shark, Maya. You've always been able to take care of yourself. You don't need the Newport house. You have this office, your penthouse, your power." It was the same old song. My strength was being used as a justification for their theft. Because I was capable, I was required to be a martyr. Because Julian was a failure, he was entitled to be a king. "I don't need the house, Mother. You're right," I said, standing up and walking to the window. "But I don't like being stolen from, and I certainly don't like being used as a silent partner in a fraud. Did you tell Chloe's father that the free and clear estate he's investing in is currently under a default notice?" Lillian went pale. The Greenwich money was the only thing keeping their house of cards from collapsing. If Chloe's father pulled out, the wedding was off. The startup was dead, and the Sterling name would be a punchline at every country club from here to Aspen. "He doesn't need to know," she whispered. "If you just pay the arrears, just for 3 months, Julian will get the investment, and he'll pay you back, I promise." "A Sterling promise," I mused, turning back to her. "I think I have enough of those in my drawer to paper a bathroom." "No, Mother. I'm done paying. But I'm not done with the house." I picked up the document I had just signed and slid it across the mahogany desk toward her. "What is this?" she asked, squinting at the fine print. "It's the secondary lien on 42 Ocean Drive," I said. "I didn't just stop paying the mortgage, I bought the debt from the bank. Which means, as of 10 minutes ago, I am Julian's lender. And since the mortgage is officially 60 days past due, thanks to the payment I forgot to make last month, I am initiating a foreclosure." Lillian staggered back as if I'd slapped her. "You're foreclosing on your own brother. You're going to take his wedding gift away." "I'm taking my asset back," I corrected her. "Julian has 30 days to come up with the $4 million balance plus interest. If he can't, and we both know he can't, the house goes to auction. Or rather, it goes to me as the primary lien holder." "You're a monster." Lillian breathed, her face contorting with genuine hatred. "You've always been jealous of him. Jealous that we loved him more. Jealous that he had a heart, while you only had a calculator. If love paid the property taxes, Mother, we wouldn't be in this room," I said, my voice as sharp as a razor. "Now I suggest you go find Julian. Tell him he has 30 days to find a real job, or he can tell his new bride that their legacy is about to become a one-bedroom rental in Queens." Lillian grabbed her bag, her eyes burning with a venomous light. Arthur was right. "We should have never let you go to that law school. It turned you into something inhuman, Cho." She stormed out, slamming the heavy oak door so hard the glass partitions rattled. I sat back down and picked up my pen. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. For the first time in my life, I felt a profound sense of order. The Sterling family had spent decades treating me like a service provider. They had forgotten the most basic rule of the service industry. When the client stops paying, the service stops. And when the client tries to steal the equipment, you take them to court. I pressed the intercom. "Sarah, send that courier to Julian's apartment. I want the foreclosure notice hand-delivered during his influencer livestream. Let's see how his followers feel about fractionalized luxury when the bailiff is standing in the background." "Yes, Ms. Sterling," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with a mix of awe and terror. I picked up my cold espresso and took a sip. The good daughter was dead. The auditor had arrived, and the Newport estate was about to have its most honest season in 30 years. The velvet noose was tightening, and for once I was the one holding the rope. The aftermath of a legal strike is rarely a loud explosion. It's a series of clicks. The sound of locks changing accounts freezing, and the sudden deafening silence of a phone that was once a siren of demands. By Friday, the Sterling family group chat had been deleted. I didn't just leave the group. I dismantled my digital footprint within their lives. I spent the morning in a glass-walled conference room with my private investigator, a man named Miller, who specialized in finding things people spent a lifetime trying to bury. "Your father's investment in Julian's fund," Miller said, sliding a tablet across the table. "It's a classic carousel fraud. Arthur took the money you sent for the Newport roof repair last year and invested it into Julian's startup to show Chloe's father that there was seed capital. Then Julian used that same money to pay the lease on the yacht for the engagement party. It's the same $20,000, traveling in a circle pretending to be $1 million. I stared at the digital trail. It was pathetic. They weren't even good criminals. They were just desperate egoists. "And the IRS?" I asked. "They're circling," Miller replied. "Arthur hasn't filed a personal return in 3 years. He's been living off loans from your corporate accounts that he never intended to repay. That's not just debt, Maya. That's tax evasion." "Good," I said, my voice cold. "Keep digging. I want to know exactly what Chloe's father, Mr. Vance, knows. I want to know if he's a victim or an accomplice." When Miller left, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went home early. My penthouse in Tribeca was a sanctuary of white marble and hushed luxury, a world I had built without a single sterling dollar. I poured a glass of vintage Bordeaux and stood on the terrace, watching the sun dip behind the Statue of Liberty. I knew exactly what would happen next. It was the Sterling playbook. First comes the outrage, then the guilt-tripping, and finally the bargaining. The bargain arrived at 7 p.m. in the form of an email from my father. No subject line. Maya. I've spoken to Julian. He's distraught. Chloe is staying with her parents in Greenwich. You've humiliated this family beyond repair. But I'm willing to offer a truce. If you drop the foreclosure and sign a personal guarantee for Julian's fund, just to get Mr. Vance back on board, I will give you a seat on the board of Sterling Real Estate. We can be a team again. Don't throw away 30 years of family history for a grudge. I read it twice. He still didn't get it. He was offering me a seat on the board of a company that existed only as a letterhead and a mountain of debt. He was trying to sell me a ticket to a shipwreck. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to my legal team with a single instruction: file the motion for expedited receivership. I was no longer interested in a seat at their table. I was interested in owning the table, the chairs and the floor they stood on. An hour later, my doorbell rang. My doorman, usually a man of impeccable discretion, sounded panicked over the intercom. "Ms. Sterling, I'm sorry, but your brother is here. He's not leaving. He's shouting about a legal kidnapping. Send him up, Marcus," I said, setting my glass down. "And call the precinct. Tell them I might need a trespass removal in 10 minutes. Julian didn't wait for the door to fully open. He pushed his way in, looking like a ghost of the man who had been spraying champagne on the yacht. His hair was greasy, his designer hoodie stained. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he spat, pacing my living room. "You think you can just delete us? I have a contract. Maya, Chloe, and I are the owners of that house. You can't just foreclose on families." "I'm not foreclosing on family Julian. I'm foreclosing on a delinquent debtor," I said, leaning against the kitchen island. "You haven't paid a cent of the interest. You haven't paid the insurance. You are in material breach of the mortgage I now hold. This isn't personal. It's contractual." "It's totally personal," he screamed. "You've always hated that Mum and Dad supported my dreams instead of just praising your billable hours. You're jealous that I'm actually liked while you're just feared." "Feared is fine, Julian. Feared gets the bills paid," I countered. "Liked is currently facing an eviction notice and a father-in-law who thinks you're a con artist. How is that brand working out for you?" Julian lunged toward me but stopped when he saw me hold up my phone. The screen showed a 911 dispatcher screen ready to dial. 30 days, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through his hysterics. "That's how long you have before the locks on 42 Ocean Drive are changed. I suggest you start packing the orchids. Or better yet, sell that fractionalized nonsense to someone who doesn't know your last name. Because in this city, the name Sterling is about to become a very expensive liability. You're going to die alone in this glass box," he hissed, backing toward the door. "Maybe," I said, watching him leave. "But I'll own the box, and I'll have the only key." As the door slammed shut, I felt a strange, chilling sensation. It wasn't regret. It was the feeling of a heavy, rusted chain finally snapping. I went back to my wine and my view. The liquidation was proceeding exactly according to plan. The Sterling family had spent 30 years betting on my loyalty. They should have bet on my math. The audit was moving into its final phase, and for the first time, the numbers were finally. The first 30 days of a foreclosure are often called the redemption period. In the legal sense, it's a window for the debtor to cure their default. In the Sterling sense, it was a window for my family to plumb new depths of psychological warfare. By Monday, the mirage of Newport had begun to evaporate. Without my monthly infusion of capital, The ecosystem of the Sterling lifestyle collapsed like a biodome with a shattered seal. The first domino fell when the landscaping crew at 42 Ocean Drive walked off the job. For 20 years, the hedges had been manicured into geometric perfection. Within 10 days of non-payment, the salt air and Rhode Island weeds began to reclaim the lawn. Then the interior staff, the housekeepers who had scrubbed the marble floors I'd paid for, simply stopped showing up. But the real collapse was digital. Julian's vagabond venture capital was bleeding out. Without the Newport estate as a backdrop for his founder videos, his credibility dipped below zero. Chloe's father, a man whose wealth was built on the cold, hard logic of manufacturing, had officially frozen the wedding fund. The Greenwich money was gone, and with it Julian's fiancée had retreated to her parents' estate, leaving my brother alone in a $5 million tomb with no electricity. I sat in my office reviewing the surveillance footage from the Newport property's ring cameras, the ones I still controlled. I watched as Julian, looking disheveled in a designer tracksuit, carried boxes of vintage wine out to his car to sell to local collectors, just to keep his phone line active. Then the second domino fell, the IRS, because I had triggered the forensic audit and flagged the loans Arthur had taken from my corporate accounts. The Treasury Department had finally opened the hood of Sterling real estate. What they found was a graveyard of unpaid payroll taxes and creative deductions that spanned a decade. My phone rang at 10 p.m. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was 860 Hartford, Connecticut, my parents' old stomping grounds. Maya. It was Lillian. But the voice wasn't the trilling operatic soprano of the Manhattan socialite. It was thin, brittle, and sounded 20 years older. "Yes, Mother. We're at a Motel 6 in Groton," she whispered. "The bank. They didn't just take the Newport house, Maya. They froze the personal accounts. Arthur's Mercedes was repossessed this afternoon while we were at lunch. They took the car right out of the parking lot." I felt a phantom pang of sympathy, a vestigial limb of the good daughter trying to twitch. I suppressed it. "The bank didn't freeze your accounts for fun, Mother. They froze them because Arthur used the corporate credit line as a personal piggy bank, and the IRS issued a levy." "We have nothing," she sobbed. "I have $40 in my purse. Arthur is... He's not well, Maya. His blood pressure is through the roof, and he can't get his refill because the insurance was cancelled. How can you sit in that penthouse and let your father die in a motel room?" "He's not dying because of me, Mother. He's dying because he spent 30 years building a house of cards and expected me to hold my breath so it wouldn't blow over. I'm just breathing now, that's all." "Gah. You're a monster," she hissed, the pity play instantly replaced by the old venom. "You've been planning this. You waited until Julian was at his most vulnerable to pull the rug out. You're doing this to punish us for loving him." "I'm doing this because I'm an adult who is tired of being a bank for people who don't like me," I said. "And for the record, Julian isn't vulnerable. He's 30 years old and perfectly capable of working at a Starbucks. If you want money for Dad's medicine, tell Julian to sell his Rolex. I know for a fact he still has it. He needs that watch for his brand." I hung up. The absurdity of it was almost poetic. They were sleeping in a Motel 6, but the brand was still sacred. They would rather drown in their own pride than admit that the daughter they'd spent years devaluing was the only thing that had kept them afloat. The next morning, I received a notification from my private investigator. Arthur and Lillian hadn't stayed in Groton. They had driven to Newport in Lillian's aging Lexus, the only asset they still owned outright, and had broken into 42 Ocean Drive. They weren't just visiting. They were squatting. Arthur had used an old key and disconnected the exterior alarm, the one I had stopped paying for. But he forgot about the internal battery-backed sensors I'd installed privately years ago. I watched the grainy footage on my laptop. There they were, Arthur and Lillian dragging suitcases through the darkened foyer of the estate. They looked like thieves in their own history. Arthur was trying to restart the generator, his face red with exertion, while Lillian sat on a sheet-covered sofa in the dark, clutching her Birkin like a holy relic. They thought that by being in the house they could stop the clock. They thought the Sterling name still carried enough weight in Newport that a sheriff wouldn't dare evict them. They were wrong. In the United States, there is nothing more sacred than a property deed and a secured debt. I didn't call them. I didn't send a warning. I simply called the Newport Sheriff's Department and filed a report for unauthorized entry and trespass on a property currently in foreclosure receivership. I want them removed, I told the deputy. But tell the officers to be gentle. They're elderly and they're confused. They seem to think it's 1995, and they still own the world. As I closed my laptop, Sarah walked in with a fresh stack of papers. The IRS has officially moved to seize the Sterling real estate office in Hartford, she said. And Julian's fiancé's father. He just filed a civil suit against Julian for fraudulent inducement regarding the investment fund. The collapse is complete, I noted, leaning back in my chair. What now, Ms. Sterling? Now, I said, looking at the clock. I go to Newport. I want to be there when the lights go out for good. I wasn't going for revenge, not exactly. I was going for the final audit. I wanted to see the exact moment they realized that a legacy built on someone else's labor isn't a legacy at all. It's just a debt that eventually comes due. I grabbed my coat and headed for the elevator. The Sterling family had spent a lifetime treating me like a ghost in the machine. It was time the ghost showed up in person to collect the keys, starting to add up in my favor. The drive from Manhattan to Newport takes about 3.5 hours, but it feels like traveling through time. As the skyscrapers of New York faded into the rolling, rocky coastline of Rhode Island, I felt the air grow colder, sharper. I arrived at 42 Ocean Drive just as the sun was beginning to bleed into the Atlantic. The iron gates, once polished to a mirror shine, were streaked with rust. The driveway was littered with dead leaves and wind-blown trash. It looked exactly like what it was, a crime scene of failed ambition. I parked my SUV at the curb and watched from the shadows. A beat-up Lexus Lillian's was parked haphazardly on the lawn. But it wasn't the only car there. A sleek white Range Rover was idling near the front door. Julian's car. I stepped out and walked toward the house, my heels clicking rhythmically on the stone. As I approached the grand mahogany doors, the sound of shouting drifted through the salt air. It wasn't the police. It was a civil war. I pushed the door open. It wasn't locked. The foyer was pitch black, save for the flickering light of a few scented candles Julian had presumably looted from his influencer stash. I don't care about your blood pressure, Dad. Julian's voice echoed off the marble walls, jagged and ugly. Chloe left me. Her father is suing me for $250,000. If I don't get the jewelry out of the safe tonight, I'm going to jail. That jewelry is your mother's pension, Arthur roared back, his voice cracking. It's all we have left. We can't sell the emeralds to pay for your legal fees, Julian. We need to live. Live where? Julian laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. In a Motel 6. You gave me this house, you told me it was mine. Now I find out it's a debt trap, and Maya is the one holding the leash. You lied to me too. I stood in the archway, a shadow among shadows. The scene was pathetic. Arthur was slumped in a Louis XIV chair, clutching his chest, while Lillian stood between them, her hands trembling as she tried to shield a small velvet box on the sideboard. Julian looked feral, his eyes bloodshot, his designer clothes rumpled. The golden sun has finally lost his shine, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a winter wind. They all froze. Julian spun around his face, contorting into a mask of pure rage. You did this. You called the bank. You called the IRS. You're the reason everything is gone. I'm the reason you had a roof over your head for the last 5 years, Julian, I said, walking into the center of the room. I'm the reason Mom's emeralds weren't hocked years ago. But the bank didn't need me to call them. They just needed you to stop paying. And you didn't just stop, you never started. It's... Maya, please. Lillian stepped forward, her face a map of desperation. Julian is in trouble. He's young, he made mistakes. But Arthur, your father is sick. You can't let them take him away. Tell the sheriff to go away. Tell the bank you'll cover it. There is no covering it anymore, Mother. The audit is closed. The results are in. This family is bankrupt financially, legally, and most importantly, morally. At that moment, the blue and red lights of the Newport sheriff's cruisers began to sweep across the walls, casting long, rhythmic shadows through the windows. Julian didn't look at me. He didn't look at his sick father. He looked at the velvet box in Lillian's hand. In one swift, violent motion, he lunged forward, snatched the box from his mother's grip, and bolted toward the back servant's entrance. "Julian, no!" Lillian shrieked, falling to her knees. He didn't look back. He left his parents in the dark, in a house they no longer owned, to face the consequences of a life he had helped them spend. The betrayal was absolute. The son they had sacrificed everything for, including their daughter's love, had just robbed them of their final safety net. I watched the back door slam shut. I didn't chase him. I didn't have to. I had already informed the police that a suspicious male might be attempting to remove assets from a foreclosed property. Arthur looked up at me, his eyes wet and hollow. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew he would do it." "I knew who he was, Arthur," I said, looking down at the man who had taught me that family was a transaction. "I just waited for you to find out too." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in the cold efficiency of the law. The sheriff's deputies were professional but firm. They didn't care about the sterling name. They didn't care about the gala photos on the walls, or the fact that Arthur had once shaken hands with governors. They saw 2 trespassers in a property with a notice of seizure taped to the front window. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," the sergeant said, his voice echoing in the empty foyer. "But the owner of record has requested immediate removal. We have a medical unit outside to evaluate you, but you cannot stay here." Lillian was a shell. She didn't scream anymore. She just allowed a female officer to help her gather a small bag of essentials, mostly toiletries, and a few framed photos. She looked at the grand staircase, then at me. Her eyes filled with a cold, dead vacuum where her pride used to be. "You're really doing it," she said, her voice a ghost. "You're putting us on the street." "I'm putting you in a car," I corrected her. "Where you go from there is up to you. I've arranged for a small apartment in Hartford near the hospital. The rent is paid for 6 months. It's not a mansion. There are no marble floors. But there's a pharmacy across the street and a social worker who will help you navigate the bankruptcy filings." "We don't want your charity," Arthur spat. "We don't want your charity," though his voice lacked any real venom. He was leaning heavily on a deputy's arm. "It's not charity, Arthur. It's a settlement," I said. "In exchange for that apartment and the legal fees I'm covering for your bankruptcy, you will sign a full confession regarding the shell companies you used to siphon money from my accounts. You will clear my name with the IRS, and you will never, under any circumstances, contact me again." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the deputies' radios. Arthur looked at the house he had built on lies, then at the daughter who had finally dismantled them. He realized he had no moves left. The king was in checkmate, and the board was being folded up. "Give me the pen," he whispered. I handed him the clipboard Sarah had prepared. He signed his name, the sterling name for the last time on a document that mattered. As they were led out to the waiting cruisers, Julian was already in the back of a different car at the end of the driveway. He had been caught trying to scale the perimeter fence with the emeralds. He was being charged with grand larceny and obstruction. He looked through the glass at me, screaming something I couldn't hear. His face twisted into a mask of impotent rage. I stood on the porch of 42 Ocean Drive and watched the red and blue lights fade into the distance. The house was finally quiet. The power was still off, but the moon was bright enough to illuminate the emptiness. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous spaces. I remembered being 10 years old and thinking this house was a palace. I remembered being 25 and thinking it was a prison. Now it was just a building. A structure of wood, stone, and bad memories. I took out my phone and called my contractor. Change the locks, all of them, and tell the security team to station a guard at the gate 24/7. I want the for sale sign up by Monday morning. Are you okay, Maya? Sarah's voice came through the line, cautious. I'm fine, Sarah, I said. And for the first time in years, I meant it. The audit is finally complete. Every debt has been settled. Every liability has been removed. And the family, I said, looking at the dark Atlantic horizon, is no longer on the books. I walked out of the house, pulled the heavy mahogany doors shut, and heard the lock click into place. It was a small sound, but it was the most satisfying thing I had heard in a decade. I didn't look back as I drove away. I didn't need to. I had spent my whole life trying to save the Sterling legacy, only to realize that the only thing worth saving was myself. The road ahead was dark, but my headlights were strong, and for the first time I knew exactly where I was going. Free, clear, and finally truly my own. The morning after the eviction, Newport felt different. The air was still biting, but the oppressive weight of the Sterling name had finally lifted from my shoulders. I stood on the balcony of a small, boutique hotel far away from the ghosts of Ocean Drive, watching the fog roll in over the Atlantic. For the first time in my life, there were no frantic voicemails to delete, no urgent wires to authorize, and no family fires to extinguish. The silence was absolute. It was the sound of a clean slate. I spent the afternoon at a local coffee shop, working from my laptop. I wasn't drafting motions or reviewing forensics. I was watching the listing for 42 Ocean Drive go live. The photos were crisp, the description clinical A premier waterfront estate offered as is. Significant architectural heritage. Price upon request. Within an hour, the inquiries started flooding in. Real estate moguls, hedge fund managers, a tech CEO from Palo Alto. To them it was a trophy. To me it was a liability I had successfully liquidated. By 3 p.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from the New York County Court. Julian's arraignment was over. How did it go? I asked when Sarah picked up. Exactly as expected. Sarah said, her voice sounding lighter. He tried to claim that the emeralds were a gift, but the deed transfer and the foreclosure papers you filed made it clear he was removing assets from a seized property. The judge set bail at $50,000. He's been calling Arthur and Lillian for hours, but they don't have the money. I finished for her. No, Sarah replied. And Chloe's father officially filed his affidavit today. Julian is being investigated for securities fraud on top of everything else. Maya, he's in real trouble. He asked if you'd take his call. Tell him I'm unavailable, I said. Indefinitely. I hung up and looked at the water. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I had expected. I just felt a profound sense of utility. I had applied the law, and the law had functioned. My brother wasn't a victim of my cruelty. He was a victim of his own belief that consequences were for people who didn't have a legacy. Before I left Newport, I made one final stop. I drove to the small, nondescript apartment complex in Hartford where I had settled my parents. It was a brick building, clean and quiet, but a world away from the manicured lawns of their former life. I didn't go inside. I didn't want a confrontation or a tearful reconciliation. I sat in my car and watched from across the street. I saw Lillian walk out to the mailbox. She wasn't wearing her silk scarves or her designer sunglasses. She was wearing a simple cardigan and looked like any other woman her age. She looked ordinary. A moment later, Arthur appeared on the small porch, leaning on a walker. He looked frail, but he was alive. He was no longer the Lion of Connecticut. He was just a man who had to figure out how to live on a fixed income and the truth. I had given them what they needed: a roof medicine and a path through the wreckage. I hadn't left them with nothing. I had left them with exactly what they had earned. I put the car in gear and turned toward the highway, heading back to New York. As I crossed the Whitestone Bridge, the Manhattan skyline rose up to meet me, a shimmering grid of steel and light. My city, my life. I thought about the Sterling Way, the belief that blood was an insurance policy and that family was a shield against the truth. It was a philosophy that had nearly consumed me, but I had survived it. I had used their own weapons, their greed, their pride, their arrogance to build the cage that now held them. Back at my penthouse in Tribeca, I walked to my home office. I opened a physical ledger I kept for my personal records. On the very last page, I wrote 3 names: Arthur, Lillian, Julian. Next to each name, I wrote a single word in bold black ink: settled. I closed the book and placed it in the back of my safe. I didn't need it anymore. The audit was over. The assets had been distributed. The liabilities had been discharged. I walked to my floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city. The lights of Wall Street were a steady, rhythmic pulse. Somewhere out there, a new story was beginning. One where I wasn't a daughter, a sister, or a savior. I was just Maya. I picked up my glass of wine and raised it to my reflection. The woman in the glass didn't look like a Sterling anymore. She looked like someone who had finally learned the most important rule of the game. In the end, the only legacy that matters is the one you don't have to lie about. I turned off the lights, leaving the office in darkness, and walked toward the rest of my life. The ledger was closed, and for the first time, the balance was perfect.